Alright everyone, it may surprise you, but I actually support the Supreme Court of the United States when it says, hey, we don't want to talk about the DACA stuff right now, sends it back down to the lower court. I think that that's the right thing to do, and I'm going to try to explain why here for people who are like, no, the Supreme Court, it's like 5-4 conservative, it should weigh in and give Trump his DACA reform. Okay, that's wonderful. As long as Trump is president, that's probably not a problem. The problem with a Supreme Court decision at the highest level of the judiciary is it sets a future precedent. What you've done then, if you allow the Supreme Court to weigh in here, is potentially permanently give the executive branch undue influence. Right now, you've got disagreement over whether it's primarily something to be handled by the president or something to primarily be handled by Congress and or even the states in some cases, or the judiciary as it's administered. If you solve that at the Supreme Court level, though, you set a more or less permanent precedent, a piece of decision that can be used to prop up executive supremacy on immigration in the future. Imagine a situation then where you get a far-left president who says, well, because of the Supreme Court decision, it works both ways, so I'm dismantling the border wall, and then I'm no longer going to have that. Anyone who comes across the border, we're going to legalize them, because I have that power as an executive. Now, I don't need to negotiate with anyone. And let's say that you have a Congress at the time, it's like, it doesn't want that to happen. They're like, no, Mr. President, you can. The president just points to the Supreme Court decision. What ends up happening, the activist lower courts may end up standing in the way of any reform that attempts to prevent legalization. And then once those people are naturalized under that precedent, you could have millions and millions of people who then can't even be deported even if you manage to go in the other direction because they've already been legalized, they've already been taken the oath of naturalization. And so you've got a problem where the Supreme Court, I think, very wisely wants to limit whether it even gets involved in this fight. I think that they want to see Trump and Congress and the states ultimately battle it out and hammer something out in a negotiating sense. Now, that's good for Trump. Trump is a good negotiator. He didn't get where he is without being one. The main problem right now is that the public stopped looking at the issue and stopped putting enough pressure on Schumer and Pelosi, ultimately. Now you see, with the Feinstein thing in California, she loses the Democratic Party of California's endorsement. The neoliberals, who are probably more willing to negotiate with Trump on that issue, are getting hammered from the far left in some of those far left regions of the country. The Democratic Party is showing signs of a schism now. Feinstein, best symbol of it ever. Feinstein's a relatively powerful neoliberal name within the Democratic Party. She's getting destroyed from the far left now. And as you've got a revolt by the progressives within the party, or not even progressives, maybe a Gillibrand sort of alliance, people who pretend to be more progressive than they are, they're more wedge issue based. They're not willing to negotiate. They're running, if they win, it's going to be on wedge issues and hardline leftism in every possible aspect. Well, we're going to ban all guns and legalize everyone and have no border, essentially. By the way, we're banning gasoline. A really, really far left, a pinko platform, basically you would have called it in the 1990s. Now, for some reason, some people think it's sane. Trump can't negotiate with people who are going to be that zealous because those people they're going to have purist platforms. They're not going to be able to negotiate. Even if they want to, even if they're willing to play the political game because they're just basically corporate neoliberals anyway, pretending to be far left. If I get elected by a bunch of people who expect me not to budge on an issue, and I budge on that issue, I probably don't get reelected. Now, do I? I'm going to have to be one hell of a good speaker in order to convince them to be the ones to give me leverage. Because otherwise, they're going to get very, very angry. It's going to be very, very difficult in some of the far left enclaves of the country for politicians not to get overhauled in favor of actual leftism, or at least pretended leftism. Trump can negotiate with a Chuck Schumer, someone who's got some leftist views, but ultimately is a neoliberal willing to negotiate. He'd go far right on an issue if he thought it would get him money or votes. Of course he would. He's a career politician. Why the fuck wouldn't he? But somebody coming from the further left would be awfully like someone from the far right. You would have like an alt-right politician. Do you honestly think that they would budge and say, okay, yeah, you're right, let's negotiate. I'm okay with legalizing several million people. No, their constituency would kick them out of office. They wouldn't even wait for the election. They'd recall them. In most instances, they wouldn't be in office very long if they attempted to. They'd be called a traitor by their own constituents. Let alone, people who share that same view who aren't even their constituents but weigh in from other parts of the country or the world. The same is true on the left. You have a radical core left that doesn't get along even well with the neoliberals. It tacitly supports them in a partisan sense, but ultimately they don't want to see any negotiation on a Trump wall or deportation or sanctuary cities or firearms or basically anything else. They're livid that he managed to pass comprehensive tax reform and is using executive orders to rescind a bunch of regulations that came from the executive branch. Oddly enough, by the way, I hate to tell people this because they don't seem to understand this. When Trump essentially relinquishes executive power by destroying existing executive level regulations, he's shrinking the power and authority of his own office. He's the opposite of an imperial president on these things. Sure, he talks a big game in public. Ultimately, though, he goes and negotiates. He says, well, we're going to do this. And then he goes to people who can get it done, says, okay, now we're going to figure out how. That means you get a little bit of what you want as well, Mr. Schumer or Mr. McConnell. Mitch McConnell at this point and Chuck Schumer are very similar. in the way that they react to Trump speaking, it's kind of funny. It's actually quite funny. Time to clank a spoon, I think. But SCOTUS made the right decision. It's not necessary for the Supreme Court to be the ones to decide this particular case. It should go back to the lower court saying, okay, figure something out. Something needs to be done. Obviously, reform is wanted. Does it or does it not predominantly require Congress, or can Trump say, hey, this essentially semi-executive action is within my purview to simply block? Then I can restore it potentially, but I expect to negotiate. It needs to go through Congress. By the way, the Democrats are nuts if they think it's not a good idea to put it through Congress. Sure, you don't have the votes at the moment. Let's say Trump didn't even exist. We didn't have a president. It was just up to Congress. You wouldn't have the votes in the House or Senate to reauthorize DACA if it were, suddenly on the ropes and up for negotiation in the absence of a judiciary defending its continuance. You wouldn't have the votes to do so, but you should anyway. You should negotiate over these things. People largely expect reform, including Democrats. They want you to negotiate it. You can take up a hard line in order to defend some of your West Coast, liberal candidates going into midterms, but it's going to backfire. I'm telling you, you drag your heels on this, it becomes a campaign issue. It's not the Republicans that suffer. It's the Democrats that suffer. You will then do worse. You'll have less support. You'll be even less capable of negotiating. And some of your candidates, Feinstein and more, endangered by the actual left. They're not going to be willing to negotiate. It will be much harder to get enough centrists cobbled together to do anything. And it'll become primarily a Republican victory. They'll probably have more House and Senate seats. Look, the generic ballot is leaving you behind. I think you're 2-3 points behind. Trump's approval has begun to rise again. The Republican candidate's approval is rising. The economy is doing well and presumably will until the midterms. You're probably going to have another, extra million or so, at least soft Republican supporters on taxes and jobs alone by then. That's the death knell of your capability of taking back the Senate and magically having a mandate to do what you want. And by the way, if you did, let's say you took the Senate back. Okay, then you have split government. Nothing will get accomplished. Absolutely nothing. Trump's willing to negotiate. You're obviously not willing to do the same. And people predominantly blame the Democrats in Congress for it, more than blame Trump. Oddly enough, nobody blames the Republicans in Congress. McConnell and John McCain, they're not exactly helping. It's actually, it's hilarious. They get sort of exonerated. The Mitt Romney lovers, they get sort of exonerated despite the fact that they're basically just Schumerites anyway. It's the same thing. They're like Pelosi Democrats. They're all the same thing. They believe in the same thing. So when you have Ted Cruz come out and say, let's be bleeding hearts, or Marco Rubio come out and say, well, we shouldn't deport everybody. Don't they sound the same as McCain and Romney and McConnell? And don't they all sound the same as a Pelosi, a Schumer, a Feinstein ultimately? Basically the same. They're identical. So SCOTUS made the right decision. That's my take on it. It's good that the Supreme Court will not be deciding this, at least at the moment. Sure, it delays Trump. He should be glad, though, because otherwise some future president could just undo everything. They could tear down the wall and reinstate DACA and legalize everyone that got kicked out and say, okay, we're not going to care about this issue anymore. We're in a borderless utopian world. Dystopian in reality, but they would have a legal precedent to make the case that they would have that power. I think that would be pretty damn bad. That's about all. Peace out.